This man, Jimmy Bam Bam Olivares, is back on the street. He's out of prison. A known gang member, Olivares was found guilty of attempted murder in 2005 during a drug deal, and he was sentenced to 24 years in prison. He served less than half of that when the parole board decided last month that he should be released, a decision the Weld County DA is not happy with.
Is that enough?
Not even close. Not even close. Like I said earlier, I've had it. I have had it with this community being inundated with early releases from the parole board.
The governor's office says there was no documentation in opposition of his parole, so he was let out. And here to talk about issues surrounding early release are Weld County DA Michael Rourke and Denise Myers of the ACLU. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
First, Michael, why get fired up about this case?
Well, like I said in the course of that previous interview, the fact that the parole board continues to let out, and I'm not just talking about all early releases, I'm talking about violent offenders, individuals who have been convicted of crimes of violence, who are serving less than half their sentence before they're being released back into our communities with no notification to the community, no public input whatsoever. Like I said earlier, I've had it. I have had it with these violent offenders being released back at such an early point in their sentence.
And you're talking all violent offenders?
I'm talking all violent offenders.
So, Denise, I know you want to chime in on this.
I do, actually. I don't know Mr. Olivares, and clearly the crime that he committed is terrible, and which is why he should have been sentenced to prison in the first instance, and of course he was. I think that notwithstanding the evidence that tells us that truth in sentencing, meaning you serve your term, the evidence tells us that that's not a good approach. That individuals, the longer and longer they stay in prison, the harder it is for them to re-engage with their communities. So frankly, that's why we have a parole board and individuals who can look at the file and make these sorts of decisions. The parole board did that. I suppose if the question is why did they do it, that's a question for them to answer. But truth in sentencing is not the approach, and we had somebody look at this file and make some decisions.
There is no truth in sentencing. There is no truth in sentencing at all. When you're looking at a 24-year sentence that all of a sudden is releasable after 11 years, that's not truth in sentencing. The difficulty that we have as prosecutors is how do we explain to a victim or to a victim's family 24 years actually means this much. It is left to way too much discretion, in my view, to the parole board who is making this decision on less than complete facts. This parole board who released Jimmy Olivares did not have all of the information necessary to make an informed decision. Their response to my outcry and my complaint was, well, we didn't receive any documentation. Let me tell you what the parole board told me yesterday when I called them and talked to them on the phone. I called and said, I want to know what offenders are up for consideration by the parole board for release in the upcoming months, a docket, so to speak. I was told, you can't have that information. At that point, they didn't know what I did for a living. I hadn't told them. I simply was asking the question. When I finally disclosed to them, I'm the district attorney in Weld County and I want to know what offenders are being considered for release, they said, we can't tell you that information. We can't tell you who is up for full board consideration. And I said, why? Well, because the schedule changes so much, it's so much in flux that we can't tell you. Now, what we can tell you is when somebody has their, quote, regular parole hearing. And I asked the question, okay, how do I get that information? Well, it's on our website. Yet an employee of the parole board could not show me on the website where that information existed. They redirected me to the Department of Corrections website. She couldn't find it on there, and when got frustrated, directed me to Victim Services at DOC. Nobody can tell you when they're up for consideration. So for them to say the DA's office in Weld County didn't provide us any information, we had no idea he was up for consideration and couldn't have possibly learned in advance.
I think that this issue, I mean, that seems to me that's a whole other issue. I mean, if you have issues or concerns about a process of knowing and whether or not the website is complicated, et cetera, that's one thing. But
it's an issue of transparency.
Well, and actually, you can go on the DOC website and find out who's eligible for parole. That's on their dashboard. It's very easy to access. But all I'm saying is that there shouldn't be truth in sentencing because the fact of the matter is that the longer people stay in prison, the more likely they are to recidivate and commit other crimes. Now, I don't know what Mr. Olivares is going to do in the future, and I wish him well. And he did serve his time, and a parole board that we entrust to make those decisions decided that. I don't want to second guess them. Clearly you are. And I just think that that's the way the process works. And I don't want people to stay in prison any longer and give them higher chances to recidivate as opposed to letting them out earlier when they have a better chance to succeed in their community.
And is your point that really this should be more of a case-by-case basis, because you don't know, clearly, you don't know who's going to go back and commit offenses again or who's actually been rehabilitated?
That's absolutely true. And that's why it is done on a file by file as opposed to saying every violent offender should serve they should serve their entire sentence. I don't know. You know, inmates, they get good credit, they get good time credit, they get a lot of opportunities to be, you know, good model citizens in the prison community, and there's reasons to look at that. And I don't think we can say automatically that Mr. Olivares didn't meet some of those check marks.
Is this an overcrowding issue? Is this a budget issue? What is it?
None of the above. It's a public safety issue. I want to be clear. It sounds like you have said on behalf of the ACLU a couple of different times there should not be truth in sentencing. What an incredible statement. You know, the individual person who knew more about Mr. Olivares than anyone else was the judge who sentenced him to 24 years in prison. He sat through the trial. He had all the pre-sentence investigation information. He was the individual who said, under our sentencing scheme, this individual deserved 24 years. For a parole board with less than complete information, now less than 11 years later, to come back and, in my view, second guess what the judge imposed back in 2005, I think is shameful. And it is not a budgetary issue. It's not an overcrowding issue. For me, this is a public safety issue. This is a man who committed an attempted murder who, after receiving a 24-year sentence, has served less than half of that and is now back in my community, where I have to be concerned about, is he going to re-victimize somebody in Weld County? And
that's a fair concern. And I am not trying to second guess the sentence that the judge imposed. Like I said earlier, I think the crime that Mr. Olivares committed is terrible. It's awful. I have a great deal of sympathy for the victims that were involved in this. I'm not trying to defend his crime at all. What I'm trying to tell you is that I think on a case-by-case basis, which is how this works, the parole board took a look at this particular prisoner 11 years later and made some decisions based on what they saw in the file and what they knew about him. You know, frankly, right now at DOC, you have individuals that are way beyond their parole eligibility, 52% of them. So it's not as if everybody who comes up for parole is granted it. So there is something here that Mr. Olivares was able to show with good faith or whatever to the parole board to say, yeah, you should be out. And I hope Mr. Olivares is a good citizen going forward.
That's something you and I will agree on.
I'm totally with you on that.
Okay, so we have less than a minute, so each of you, 30 seconds, what would you like to see happen from here?
You know, what I would like to see happen is a significant conversation about how the parole board goes about making these determinations on violent offenders. I would like to see some additional legislation that says if you commit one of these designated crimes of violence, you serve X amount of your parole before you are ever considered for parole by this parole board.
You mean an X amount of time of their prison time?
Yes.
I think in my last 30 seconds, I would say it's a case-by-case, and I would hate to see legislation that puts everybody and presumes that everybody is on the same playing field at every point in their life. Once you commit your crime and you serve some time and you've been punished, and there ought to be a process that is on a case-by-case basis, and that's what happened here. There are things that we need to do to fix transparency. I'm all for that.
Denise Myers, Michael Rourke, thank you both. We appreciate you both being here and
thank you for
sharing
having
your
us.
opinion with us. Appreciate
Thank you.
We'll be right back.